Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Ulysses S. Grant, Part 11, Fighting for American Indians in the West. We stopped last time in 1872. President Ulysses S. Grant was tired, but he decided to seek a re-election to a second term to find out how the American people felt about all the criticism his administration had been receiving. He yearned for affirmation, a vote of confidence from the American people. In March of 1871, there was a Republican breakaway party that met in Cincinnati, Ohio. The leaders were Jacob Cox and Carl Schurz. They associated Reconstruction with corruption and wanted the U.S. military to withdraw from the South. On March 1st, 1872, President Grant signed legislation creating Yellowstone National Park. This was the beginning of the national park system. May of 1872, these liberal Republicans had their meeting in Cincinnati. They supported home rule in the South. They were against the Ku Klux Klan Act. They wanted a union of North and South. The Republican regular convention was in Philadelphia in June. Grant was the unanimous nominee for president. His former vice president, Schuyler Colfax, was removed because his association with the Credit Mobilier scandal, and Henry Wilson of Massachusetts replaced him as vice presidential nominee. In July, the Democrats had their convention. Horace Greeley was nominated for president. Greeley had been famous by making anti-Democrat slurs, and now he was the nominee of the party. Greeley had famously said, quote, "Not all Democrats were horse thieves, but all horse thieves were Democrats." He also said that the Democrats were, quote, "traitors, slave whippers, drunkards, and lecherous beasts." And the Democrats were very much against Reconstruction. President Grant continued to protect black Americans. He met black leaders, and he supported global abolitionism. He supported emancipation in Brazil. He condemned slavery in Cuba and Puerto Rico. Black Americans gave their total support to President Grant in his re-election bid. Charles Sumner wrote an open letter to blacks opposing Grant. This was shocking. Frederick Douglass supported Grant. Grant's friends included Confederate General John Singleton Mosby, who helped Grant win Virginia. Confederate general. Grant did not campaign, which was the custom of the time. During the election campaign, Frederick Douglass said, quote, "The Republican Party is the ship, and all else the sea." Grant went to Long Branch, New Jersey during the campaign. Greeley campaigned by train. Grant became the first president to face the feminist movement. The National Woman Suffrage Association, an organization fighting for women's right to vote, had been established in 1869 by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They wanted women to be able to vote. In 1872, the Equal Rights Party was launched, and Victoria Woodhull was a candidate for president of the United States. So there was a woman president in 1872 of this minor party. In June at the Republican convention, Susan B. Anthony said that she wanted them to have to be pro-women's vote. In the platform, the language said that there was respectful consideration to the rights of women. Susan B. Anthony believed that Julia Grant supported the women's vote, and Anthony supported President Grant in the 1872 election. Susan B. Anthony voted illegally in 1872. She was arrested, tried, found guilty, but did no prison time. As we said, in the 1872 election, Grant's vice presidential candidate had been changed. Schuyler Colfax replaced by Henry Wilson. It was said in 1872 that there were two types of Republicans: conscience Republicans, who were former abolitionists who believed in good fighting evil, and capitalist Republicans, who were practical men devoted to work and business. Grant biographer H.W. Brands wrote, quote, "The conscience Republicans reminded Grant of why the Civil War had been fought. The capitalist Republicans of how the war had been won." In 1872, President Grant met Spotted Tail, a Sioux American Indian chief, and Spotted Tail said, quote, "I hear that in a few months there will be an election for a new president. I hope you may be successful. This would please me very much, for you have been very kind to my people." During the election, blacks, large majority, voted for Grant. In Louisiana, there was violence. Grant won the election and was reelected with 56% of the vote. Republicans controlled the House and Senate and the White House. However, support in the North for Reconstruction was weakening. Horace Greeley lost the election. His wife died the night before, and Greeley died November 29th, only 3 weeks after the election. So if he had lived, he would not have served. But maybe losing, especially his wife dying, was the major factors there. After his re-election, Grant met with African American leaders at the White House, and Grant said that he was the first president of the United States elected by the whole people. November, also, the Credit Mobilier scandal became famous. This had to do with the Transcontinental Railroad, which was a government contract. Executives in this company gave themselves lavish salaries. House Speaker James Blaine and Congressman James Garfield, along with Vice President Schuyler Colfax, were implicated. Another scandal happened. There was Congress had voted a 50% raise for itself, $5,000 a year salary for congressmen to $7,000, and the president's salary raised from $25,000 to $50,000. And they voted that this would be retroactive for 2 years, going back 2 years. This meant a $5,000 windfall for each member of Congress. The public didn't like that. 1873, March 3rd, was Ulysses S. Grant's second inauguration. It was very cold, only 4 degrees. It was the coldest inauguration in history until that time. It was impossible for the musicians to play in tune because of the cold. Grant sat in a chair that George Washington had used at the first inauguration in New York City. At 12:30 p.m., Chief Justice Salmon Chase was 2 months before his death, and he administered the oath of office to President Grant. In his inaugural address, President Grant referred to the Indian Wars in the West, and he had advocated leniency for American Indians. In his inaugural address, President Grant said, quote, "Our great maker is preparing the world in his own good time to become one nation, speaking one language, and when armies and navies will be no longer required." At the inaugural ball, it was held in a large wooden building that was built specially. There were hundreds of canaries brought to sing, and there were black guests. However, there was no heat. The champagne and food froze. The canaries died of the cold. It was a short ball. It was too cold. Grant and Julia left early, and others followed. Louisiana was President Grant's greatest challenge. There was hatred and corruption there. Henry Clay Warmoth, a Republican carpetbag governor, was struggling to lead that state. Louisiana had a culture of corruption. In 1872, in the governor election, William Pitt Kellogg, the Republican, was pitted against John McHenry, the Democrat. Both claimed victory, and there were 2 inaugurations in Louisiana. This was a real dilemma. Grant planned a trip south. However, there were death threats against him, and he canceled that trip. In Louisiana, there was a breakdown of law and order. A federal judge ruled in favor of Kellogg to be the next governor. In April, there was violence. William Ward, a black Republican, against Christopher Columbus Nash, a Democrat, regarding control of Grant Parish. Both had armed supporters. Ward's supporters were at the county seat at Colfax at the courthouse. Nash attacked. The blacks were massacred. 73 to 300 died. Grant believed that federal power was needed to protect blacks in the South, a continuation of that. In May, Governor Kellogg sent a message to Grant and said there was an insurrection in 3 Louisiana parishes. Grant was fighting the white supremacist groups, including the White League. In August, Governor Kellogg wrote to Grant that there was terror in Louisiana before the election. In September, there was anarchy in New Orleans, violence, fighting to overthrow the government. Grant sent 5,000 troops. Governor Kellogg was restored. However, there was fatigue in the North regarding the trouble that black people were facing in the South and helping them. Many Northerners wanted to end federal involvement in the South. September of 1873, Grant met with his cabinet talking about Governor Kellogg and the stories of his corruption and incompetence. Grant ended the violent overthrow of the Louisiana state government, and he received death threats as a result. In the November elections, McHenry and the Democrats controlled the Louisiana State Senate, and Kellogg, the governor. The Republicans had the governor's seat. In early January, Grant sent Phil Sheridan to take command in Louisiana with the U.S. Army. Sheridan investigated what had happened in Louisiana. Since the end of the Civil War in Louisiana, 2,100 blacks had been killed and 2,100 wounded. After the election, the national election, Supreme Court Justice Samuel Nelson retired. He was replaced by Ward Hunt of New York. In May of 1873, Supreme Court Chief Justice Salmon Chase died. It was hard to find a replacement. Roscoe Conkling was offered the position and refused. Morrison R. Waite of Ohio was appointed. 1873, President Grant's father, Jesse, was ill. Grant traveled to see him, but Jesse died June 29, 1873, in Covington, Kentucky. Grant was en route. Grant's grief was deep for the death of his father. December 15th, Julia's father, Colonel Dent, died. Also, Ulysses and Grant's son, Fred, was at West Point. Fred went on to be a part of the survey tour of the Rocky Mountains as a civil engineer. He joined General Sherman for a European tour. In 1874, Fred was with General George Custer in the Black Hills. Ulysses and Julia's other son, Buck, was at Harvard. He went to law school at Columbia. Their third son, Jesse, was in poor health and was in college at Cornell. Their daughter, Nellie, in 1872, went on a European trip with family friends. She met Queen Victoria at Buckingham Palace. She toured Paris and other European capitals. On the voyage home, she met an Englishman, Algernon Sartoris, who was minor gentry in England. His father was in Parliament. They fell in love, and they were married on May 21st, 1874 at the White House, and then moved to England, and Nellie had a very unhappy marriage. Her husband, Sartoris, was an alcoholic and a womanizer. Grant and Julia were heartbroken that their daughter would be moving across the Atlantic Ocean and had no idea how bad it would be for their daughter, Nellie, with her husband. In 1873, the economy was strong. The U.S. was exporting cotton, bread, iron, steel, leather, and shoes. There was a post-war economic boom. Steel, petroleum, the mass industries. However, there was dangerous banking. On September 8th, the Wall Street banks closed. The stock market and gold collapsed. Jay Cooke was bankrupt. Grant was under pressure and agreed to purchase Treasury bonds. This was the start of the Great Depression, which lasted 5 years. Half of all railroad companies went bankrupt. Crop prices dropped. There was a rise in unemployment and also a rise in radical labor unions. Midterm elections in 1874, the Democrats did well. They took control of the House. Republicans still controlled the Senate. The public was anti-Reconstruction. The Democrats were investigating Republican corruption. The Democrats retook control in Alabama. Grant wanted a transcontinental canal. In his annual message, he reproached white Southerners for abusing black Americans in the South. He pleaded with white Southerners to treat blacks with justice, or President Grant had no choice but to send troops south. He pled for help for Republicans in the South. Now, the Democrats cut spending in the Justice Department and for Reconstruction. There was a scandal with Attorney General George Williams, who resigned and was replaced by Edwards Pierpoint. Mississippi, there was conflict 55 of the 115 state representatives were black. In 1874, the 9 of the 37 state senators were black. There was intimidation of black voters and an effort to remove black office holders. On July 4th, 1874, in Vicksburg, there was a celebration of Grant's victory in the Civil War. Black Republicans came to that. White thugs fired into the crowd and several died. Governor Ames wanted federal troops to protect black voters, but this time Grant refused to send troops. In the Mississippi election, blacks had been terrorized and stayed home. The Republicans lost. The White League was mobilizing in Louisiana, Arkansas, Alabama, and South Carolina with the same goal and result: to disenfranchise black voters and for the Democrats to take power in those states. December 5th, there was a coup in Vicksburg. Warren County Courthouse was seized. The black sheriff fled. Black and white militias fought. There was a massacre of blacks, 21 dead and 300 killed in the country. Mississippi governor and the legislator asked Grant to send troops. There was no common ground between white and black people in the South, very tragically. In Louisiana, blacks were being terrorized by the White Leaguers. Grant sent Phil Sheridan to Vicksburg and Jackson, New Orleans, to collect information. In Louisiana, the Democrats and Republicans both claimed majority of the legislature. Governor William Pitt Kellogg requested General Philip R. de Trobriand to remove 5 Democrats in the legislature. Sheridan wanted to arrest White League leaders. Northerners did not support soldiers going to the State House in Louisiana. The New York World reported, quote, "Tyranny, a sovereign state murdered." Again, the more death threats against President Grant. The Pennsylvania legislature condemned federal action in Louisiana. On January 13, 1875, President Grant gave a speech to the Senate. He spoke from the heart. He was frustrated about violence inflicted on black people in the South and Republicans there. He wanted to remove federal troops from the South. However, he could not allow violence against blacks in the South to go without a response. The public in the North did not support federal action in the South by 1874. White Southerners called it redemption over Reconstruction. Newspapers in New Orleans supported the murder of Sheridan and heckled him in the hotel dining room. In Louisiana, there was a compromise. The Democrats took control of the legislature, and the Republicans still controlled the governor's seat under Governor Kellogg. Some could see a second Civil War coming. Blacks in the South were living in fear. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 outlawed segregation, but it was not enforced. There was a famous Thomas Nast cartoon that showed Grant with his problems and issues, and the slogan was, "A burden he has to shoulder." 1875, the whiskey ring scandal broke. This involved a whiskey tax evasion. Grant visited St. Louis and his old friend, General John McDonald, in October of 1874. McDonald was part of the whiskey ring, and Grant didn't know it. June of 1874, the Treasury Secretary, Benjamin Bristow, was fighting the whiskey ring. Orville Babcock, Grant's assistant, was involved. McDonald resigned. This was a major public scandal. Orville Babcock, Grant's assistant, was deep into the whiskey ring. Grant was honest and unable to believe that there was corruption in his most confidential aide. Grant wanted justice for those involved in the whiskey ring and said, quote, "Let no guilty man escape." During the whiskey ring scandal, there was evidence that Grant's brother Orville and brother-in-law Fred Dent were involved. On December 9th, Babcock was indicted. Grant had faith in his innocence. His brother Orville and brother-in-law Fred were cleared. Grant gave a deposition where he defended Babcock. Benjamin Bristow was the attorney general. Grant was angry with him. Bristow considered resigning. Babcock was tried and acquitted. There was evidence that Babcock was involved in the Jay Gould gold swindle. Babcock finally resigned under all this pressure he was under. He was given the job of the inspector of the 5th Lighthouse District. In 1884, he drowned and died at Mosquito Inlet in Florida. So Bristow was gone, one of Grant's top aides. The Grant administration had 350 indictments against the whiskey ring culprits. Grant's greatest pain in his life was the deception by his friend, Orville Babcock. The public had faith in Grant's honesty. There would be no third term for him. He was tired of 16 years of public service. Julia was unhappy that there would be no third term. She wanted to stay in the White House. Ulysses S. Grant was a Methodist Christian. In 1875, he supported the Chautauqua movement and their Christian summer camps. He attended and spoke and praised the Bible for its role in progress and civilization and promoting education. He talked about assimilating immigrants and healing the wounds of the Civil War. 1875 in September, in Clinton, Mississippi, there was a Republican barbecue. The White Line Rifle Club showed up. 8 blacks were shot and killed. They returned fire. 3 whites were dead. Governor Ames asked Grant for help. Grant was uncertain because support for Reconstruction in the North was so weak. He decided not to send troops. There was white terror to keep blacks from voting. The Democrats were succeeding in elections, and their power was being restored. 1875, Secretary of the Interior Columbus Delano was involved in the Indian ring corruption. Orville Grant received 4 profitable Indian trading posts. The president's brother, the Secretary of War William Belknap, was involved in another news scandal. Secretary of War William Belknap. Now there were Indian trading posts. People were receiving $20,000 to have control of those. Belknap resigned because of his connection with this corruption. He was replaced by Alphonso Taft, the father of William Howard Taft. In 1875, Republicans had control of 4 southern states: Florida, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana. The black people were the majority of the Republicans there. There was another Thomas Nast cartoon in 1874. This depicted resistance to Reconstruction in the South. It depicted the White League and Ku Klux Klan terrorizing a black couple and their baby. The Attorney General Pierpont became minister to England, and Alphonso Taft replaced him. James Cameron was the new war secretary. Grant favored Hamilton Fish to be the next president. In 1876, the Republican Convention in June in Cincinnati, Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes, Ohio governor, was nominated. William A. Wheeler of New York was his vice presidential nominee. Grant supported Hayes, the Republican nominee, in the new election. The Democrats in late June had their convention in St. Louis, Missouri. Samuel J. Tilden, the New York governor, was nominated by the Democrats. 1876 was the U.S. centennial. It had been 100 years since the Declaration of Independence in 1876. There was an international exhibit in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This involved manufacturing, art, science, and civilization. On May 10th, President Grant opened the fair with the Emperor and Empress of Brazil. There was a centennial inauguration march composed by Richard Wagner and a hymn by John Greenleaf Whittier. At this centennial, there was a Remington typographic machine. George Washington's dentures were on display, along with Benjamin Franklin's hand press and the right arm and torch of the Statue of Liberty. Also in 1876, there was conflict with American Indians on the Great Plains, the Black Hills of South Dakota. The Oglala Sioux had a large reservation there in 1867 by treaty, and there was Fort Laramie nearby. The Black Hills were a holy area for the Sioux Indians. Phil Sheridan was a leader in the army fighting Indians. Sheridan believed that the Indians were barbaric. In 1874, there were rumors of gold in the Black Hills, and Sheridan sent George Armstrong Custer and the 7th Cavalry to hunt for a new site for a new army fort. 1876, there was a gold rush to the Black Hills as European descent Americans in large numbers came. This was Sioux sacred land. Grant traveled to the Indian Territory in October of 1874. He was the first president to go there. Grant offered the Sioux $6 million for the Black Hills. May 26th of 1875, he met the Sioux Indian leaders at the White House, and Grant asked them to move south. He said that he needed to allow white people to move into the Black Hills. Professor Othniel Marsh of Yale College talked about the corruption of the Red Cloud Agency, furnishing the Sioux with supplies northwestern Nebraska, near the Black Hills, where they'd been supplied putrid pork, inferior flour, rotten tobacco, and shoddy goods. Commissioner of Indian Affairs Columbus Delano resigned. He was replaced by Zachariah Chandler, Michigan senator. In November of 1874, there was a wave of gold miners arriving in the Black Hills. The decision was made to force Sitting Bull and his band of Sioux to move away from the Black Hills by January 31st, 1876. If not, the military would move them by force. Sitting Bull would not leave. The army was sent to take action against Sitting Bull. This included George Armstrong Custer, who had flair, was flamboyant, and audacious. Custer was vain, headstrong, and narcissistic and cruel. On July 4th, Custer and 263 men under his command were killed by Lakota Sioux Indians in northern Cheyenne along the Little Bighorn River in southern Montana. Custer ignored orders to wait for others and went ahead, was outnumbered. On August 11th, President Grant asked Congress to expand the cavalry by 2,500 to fight American Indians in the West. In December, the U.S. government took legal possession of the Black Hills. November 22nd, Vice President Henry Wilson died and was not replaced. President Grant said, quote, "There is a large class of professedly reputable men who use every means in their power to bring on Indian wars for the sake of the profit to be realized from the presence of troops and the expenditure of government funds in their midst. They proclaim death to the Indians at all times, in words and publications, making no distinction between the innocent and the guilty. They incite the lowest class of men to the perpetration of the darkest deeds against their victims, and as judges and jurymen shield them from the justice due to their crimes. Every crime committed by a white man against an Indian is concealed or palliated. Every offense committed by one Indian against a white man is borne on the wings of the post or telegraph to the remotest corner of the land, clothed with all the horrors which the reality or the imagination can throw around it." You can see President Grant's support for American Indians here. He was very sympathetic. In the 1876 election, the Democrats were strong in the South. This was challenging for Hayes and the Republicans, who had scandals. The Democrats were abusing blacks. By this time in Reconstruction, there were 3,000 troops in the South. In South Carolina, there was violence against blacks to keep them from voting. President Grant sent 1,000 troops there by Election Day to South Carolina. Mississippi, there was also violence. This helped the Democrats to succeed. In the election of 1876 between Rutherford B. Hayes and Sam Tilden, there was no clear winner. Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina were in dispute. This was the closest election in American history, and it was a crisis. It was close to civil war again. In South Carolina, there were 2 governors and 2 legislatures. Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina all claimed victory. January of 1877, President Grant created an election commission to decide the disputed election, and that commission ruled that Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina would be for Hayes, which meant that Rutherford B. Hayes won the election. In negotiations, Hayes and the Republicans pledged to end Reconstruction. At the end of his second term, President Grant received a delegation of Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Greek Indians who were grateful to him for his efforts for the welfare of American Indians. Grant's gloom was gone. He was happy to leave the White House. He planned an around-the-world trip. The Orville-Babcock betrayal was devastating. He needed a secretary he could trust. Rutherford B. A. Hayes' inauguration was scheduled for Sunday, March 4th. However, Grant and Hayes did not like to have the inauguration on a Sunday, So on Saturday, March 3rd, Hayes was inaugurated in a private ceremony at the White House, and on Monday there was an inauguration for the public. Grant was tired of being president. Rutherford B. Hayes was the new president. Grant felt like a boy getting out of school. However, he was uncertain how to make a living and where he would live. In his military life, he had been to many places, and he was interested in traveling. Grant left the White House and stayed in the home of Hamilton Fish in Washington, D.C. till late March. He traveled and toured Cincinnati, St. Louis, Chicago, Galena, Illinois, where huge crowds came to see him. He was worried about money. He had invested in a mining venture and received a windfall of $25,000. He planned to use that money to travel for 2 years. His son, Buck, was managing his money. He long desired to visit Europe. A recent book by Jules Verne, Around the World in 80 Days, promoted the glamour in foreign travel. So Grant planned a trip around the world, which became a diplomatic event. He traveled on U.S. warships and departed Philadelphia for Liverpool on May 17th on the steamship Indiana. He brought journalist John Russell Young to write about the trip for the newspapers. The trip lasted 2 years and 4 months. On May 28th, former President Grant and Julia arrived in Liverpool, Great Britain. Well, that concludes today's presentation. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.